Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
This episode is brought to you by Polestar. Time is luxury, which is why Polestar spent so much time designing the Polestar 3, their luxury electric performance SUV. It's designed to go further with up to 315 miles of range and immerse you in a unique listening experience powered by 25 speakers. Your favorite daily news podcast has never sounded better. All to make the time you spend behind the wheel of Polestar 3 the best time of your day. Book your test drive at Polestar.com.
The Filipino community in the U.S. among those who took on a more active role, encouraging residents to vote.
In 2020, a range of political orgs, including the Filipino Americans for Biden organization, worked hard to encourage Filipino Americans to make their way to the polls on Election Day.
We've been able to really canvass, call, and get the troops out, if you will, by connecting through social media, like you just mentioned. We've been spending countless hours on the phones trying to get out Filipino Americans in particular to the polls, both in Michigan, in North Carolina, and in Georgia, and in Pennsylvania, and in many, many other states.
Their efforts were successful. In 2020, according to Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Filipino Americans produced a larger jump in voter turnout than any other demographic group in every single swing state. In swing states, in which the election outcome often comes down to a handful of votes, such jumps in Filipino American voter turnout have the power to make a substantial difference. This is particularly true in Nevada, in which Filipino Americans make up roughly 5% of the population, more than any other swing state. So then, how might Filipino Americans voters in Nevada impact the upcoming election? Who might they vote for? Let's find out.
Welcome back to Immigrantly. In this limited election series podcast produced by Immigrantly Media, we discuss issues that matter to some of the most overlooked immigrant and minority communities in the U.S. As the election season continues, we'll examine key moments that offer insight into what to expect in November. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the often overlooked community of Filipino American voters in the key swing state of Nevada. We are your host, Juan Ramirez, independent journalist.
And I'm Sara Sadhwani, a political science professor. And this is Nationally.
Filipino Americans are part of America's fastest growing demographic group, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. In Nevada, AAPI Americans make up roughly 10 to 11% of the population. While relatively new, the Asian American community in Nevada is quickly growing. In recent years, and in 2020, Filipino Americans produced a larger jump in turnout than any other group in every single swing state, including Nevada. Within the state, many Filipino Americans are concentrated primarily in the southern suburbs of Las Vegas, one of the most politically competitive regions of the country. There, their votes are incredibly influential. Grace Vergara Magdal, executive director of the state branch of the Service Employees Union, told the Nevada Independent, quote, "It's refreshing to see we're not an afterthought anymore. AAPI used to be an afterthought. Candidates who do not pay attention to the AAPI community risk losing their election," unquote. So Who are Filipino American voters?
A few general demographic trends might be helpful to consider in our discussion. As of 2022, 2/3 of the total Filipino American population was eligible to vote. 2.7 million eligible Filipino American voters. According to data collected by the Pew Research Center, in 2022, the median annual income among Filipino American households was $100,600, placing many Filipino American families in the middle class. We should mention that 75% of Filipino Americans are Christian, primarily Catholic.
It's interesting because when I think about Filipinos, Filipino Americans particularly, I always think California. I always think Southern California specifically. This community in Vegas is growing. It's a growing community.
Yeah. And amongst that, Filipino Americans have such an interesting sort of history in the United States and even amongst Asian Americans, right? The Philippines was once a colony of the United States. And before that, a colony of Spain, right? So in some ways that there might be some affinity, I suppose, between Filipinos and Latinos.
Right. And we could always go back to not so recent history where, Filipino Americans were some of the organizers of many civil rights movements in California, specifically with the United Farm Workers. So yes, there is a very close affinity to Latinos and Filipinos.
Absolutely. And here in California, the Attorney General, Rob Bonta, perhaps the highest ranking Filipino American in California politics, often talks about from his parents' perspective that they grew up in the Central Valley and that they were organizers along with Cesar Chavez. And then the other key thing I think that's so unique about Filipino Americans is that so many served in the U.S. military at the end of World War II. And so many Filipinos came to the United States and earned citizenship through their service, and there had been a really long campaign to access that citizenship and to make that more available. So it is really this unique community. And we hear so much about Nevada as a politically important state, and yet we don't often hear this story about Filipino Americans in Nevada and the importance of their vote and to what extent candidates are actually doing that outreach to this community in particular. Let's talk a little bit about the political beliefs of Filipino Americans, right? Where do Filipino American voters lie on this political spectrum? And this question is perhaps more complicated than you might think. As a whole, most registered Filipino American voters appear to lean towards the Democratic Party. According to AAPI data, where I'm also a senior researcher, 39% of Filipino Americans identified as Democrats in a recent survey. 22% identified as Republicans. Meanwhile, 30% identified as independents. And so when it comes to their politics, as a group, Filipino Americans actually have a third of voters that consider themselves as independents, leaving the door open for both the Democratic and Republican parties to make a play.
And while Filipino American voters support many democratic policies, many are ultimately socially conservative on a number of issues due to their strong Catholic faith. On one hand, many Filipino American voters agree with the Democratic Party's support for small businesses, healthcare, and putting an end to anti-Asian hate, among several other policies. In regards to healthcare, in July, one Filipino American voter attending a Biden-Harris rally in Las Vegas told ANC,
kailangan natin ng si Biden na mapagpatuloy niya yung mga pinapakinabangan natin ngayon. We do not want to lose the Affordable Care Act na ine-enjoy natin ngayon.
In addition to these more liberal policies, many Filipino Americans were put off by Trump's handling of COVID in 2020. Filipino American healthcare workers were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. While Filipino nurses comprise about 4% of the national nursing workforce, they made up nearly a third of the total COVID death among nurses.
According to the Nevada Independent in 2020, Nevada resident Vida Benavides, a Democratic consultant who has worked within the AAPI community for several decades, said, as a Filipino, I'm voting because I have relatives who are on the front lines. And actually, I don't think it just stops there. Donald Trump also scapegoated the the Asian American community during COVID.
Okay, why do you keep calling this the Chinese virus? There are reports of dozens of incidents of bias against Chinese Americans in this country. Your own aide, Secretary Azar, says he does not use this term. He says ethnicity does not cause the virus. Why do you keep using this? A lot of people say it's racist.
It's not racist at all. No, not at all. It comes from China. That's why. It comes from China. I want to be accurate.
About Chinese Americans in this country. There's aides behind you. Are you comfortable with this term?
I have great love for all of the people from our country. But as you know, China tried to say at one point, maybe they stopped now, that it was caused by American soldiers. That can't happen. It's not going to happen. Not as long as I'm president. It comes from China.
And we saw the rise of hate incidents all over America. And quite frankly, while most of that was targeted towards Chinese Americans, anyone of East Asian descent or Southeast Asian descent ended up being impacted by that and the acts of violence and hatred that sprung up. And many within the Asian American community were further alienated by the former president's anti-Asian rhetoric during the pandemic.
The coronavirus impacts communities around the globe. Here at home, Asian Americans are facing more than just the fear of contracting the virus. They say that hurtful and misleading language from our nation's leaders are now making things worse. Our Kira Phillips has this follow-up.
As Asian Americans continue to share stories of violence and discrimination, messaging from some of our politicians not making it any easier.
At the same Biden-Harris rally in Las Vegas in July, Filipino American Nevada State Assembly member Erica Mosca told ANC,
"When I think about former President Donald Trump, he said pretty awful things about the Asian community. He stoked AAPI hate. So for me, it's all about staying true, staying focused, and making sure we can show who actually cares. We have the #1 most ANHPI cabinet members ever in our history because of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris."
Trump's consistent anti-immigration rhetoric and policies has further frustrated some Filipino American voters.
In 2020, the Philippines had the second longest backlog of visa applications after Mexico, with nearly 300,000 waiting to gain acceptance into the country. Today, while improved, many Filipinos continue to face long wait times. So do Filipino Americans support Harris then? Many Democrats are hoping that Filipino Americans, as well as other members of the Asian American community, will be energized by the prospect of voting for an Asian American woman into office.
All of this, then, it seems, would suggest support for the Democrats. And yet, there is an element of social conservatism present among many Filipino American voters. This is particularly relevant when it comes to the issues of abortion, of which many Filipino Americans are strongly opposed. In a post-MAGA rally interview, conservative Filipino American organizer Guy De Perio said of Filipino values, quote, "Your values are conservative. They are aligned to the right with the Republican Party. They are not aligned for abortions. Late-term abortions at birth, that is not who the Catholic faith is for. That is not what the Filipino is for. They value conservative values." Unquote.
According to a poll by AAPI data, it's estimated that roughly 34% of Filipino Americans supported Trump in 2020. In a Rappler article entitled "Trying to Understand Filipino American Catholics Who Voted for Trump," Filipino American journalist Christian Seno provides a personal account of various relatives who supported Trump in 2020. He claims that many of his relatives chose to support Trump primarily because of his anti-abortion stance, choosing to look past issues of racism, immigration, education, and healthcare, merely because, as faithful Catholics, they were intently focused on the issue of abortion.
Another important factor pushing Filipino American voters rightward, Filipino American patriotism. When it comes to courting the Filipino American vote, the Washington Post calls this the Republicans' secret weapon. The U.S. has been consistently viewed very favorably in the Philippines, even during Trump's time in office. The Philippines was an American colony from 1898 to even recent 1946. During World War II, the U.S. liberated the Philippines from Japanese rule. And roughly 52% of Filipino Americans are now US born. In sum, many Filipino Americans are very patriotic.
It seems that in some instances, this sense of patriotism has come to be tied up with conservative values. For example, many believe in fulfilling the American dream purely through hard work and determination, a pure, pull yourself up by the bootstraps approach, devoid of outside help or assistance of any kind.
Right, and perhaps because of all of these reasons, an analysis by CNN found a significant shift towards the Republican Party. It is uncertain whether or not we will truly see a conservative in the 2024 election, but it appears to be a real possibility. And Sarah, as we're saying all of this, one thing comes to mind. Filipino Americans remind me of the Latino vote, of the values that they have, specifically tying them to Catholicism. And I can't help to think of my family members who think very similar to that. Religion really sways their political views.
Especially abortion for Catholics, right? That oftentimes that's the main concern that brings you to the ballot box. Despite the fact that you might have many other concerns, it's that one that you vote on.
With all this information, Sarah, I'm just wondering if it is in fact that Filipino Americans have the power to sway the election within the state of Nevada. And if they do, why do we not hear more about this discussion within the media or amongst politicians themselves surrounding the importance of the Filipino vote?
Yeah. I mean, it's such a classic question. I think we can ask some version of that question in almost every episode that we record, right, JD? Yep. But, I think in this instance, right, first of all, Filipinos, it's a large group, as we've identified here, but classically get lumped in with all other Asian Americans. So there's been a few articles that have been written about even the Senate race that's going on in Nevada and the outreach to Asian American communities. And we should hear more about it, right? Overall, Asian Americans have increased their voter participation exponentially over the last several years. In 2016, voter turnout of Asian Americans was 49%. In 2020, it was 60%, the largest increase in voter turnout amongst any racial or ethnic group. So, in fact, people should be talking even more about Asian Americans and, in this case, Filipinos. So many Asian Americans are registered with no party preference. Candidates don't necessarily know who they're going to vote for. It's not predetermined by the registration where you can expect an Asian American to cast that ballot. And that means for many Asian Americans, they're fair game to both Democrats and Republicans. And candidates have to do the work to go out and earn their vote. And I think that's happening below the radar, but we just don't hear a whole lot about it. It was happening in Georgia. Raphael Warnock's campaign put a lot of effort into outreach to API communities. And I think it is happening in Nevada, but you're right. We just don't hear about it.
There's a lot of factors in there, but yes.
Yeah.
And with that being said, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we'll continue the conversation on Filipino Americans in the swing state of Nevada.
Don't go anywhere. We're back. Before the break, we were talking about how Filipino Americans' values tend to lean to the right and how this could play out in the election.
Let's continue that conversation now.
So, how are the Democratic and Republican parties going about gaining Filipino American support in important states such as Nevada? Both parties have taken various actions to court the Filipino American vote and the Asian American vote more broadly. Let's start with the Democrats. In October of 2023, during Filipino American History Month, Harris made a point as to pay tribute to Filipino Americans and their contributions to the country. On October 3rd, she posted on X, "Filipino Americans contribute to our nation's success every single day. During Filipino American History Month, our administration celebrates the important role that Filipino Americans have played and continue to play in the American story." End quote. She further claimed that the Biden-Harris administration is, quote, "proud to honor generations of Filipino Americans who have ensured our nation remains a land of hope, opportunity, and optimism." As a whole, when it comes to courting Asian American voters, the Harris campaign appears to be focusing much of its efforts on the issues of health care and anti-Asian hate. In August, Harris and Walz released their first presidential campaign ads aimed at appealing to Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander voters. The first of these ads, titled Reduced, centers around the issue of health care, accusing Trump of attempting to take away the Affordable Care Act, while alluding to the ways in which this act has benefited those within the AAPI and Native Hawaiian communities, reducing the number of uninsured individuals by 63%.
The Affordable Care Act has helped us more than anyone else, but Donald Trump wants to rip it all away.
Trump scares me. He wants to terminate health care protections for people in our community.
Trump is bad for our health.
The second of these ads, titled The Seal, centers around anti-Asian hate, criticizing Trump's inflammatory anti-Asian pandemic rhetoric.
Kung flu, China plague, or the China virus.
When Trump called COVID the Kung flu, he unleashed a wave of hate against our community. I was scared. People didn't feel safe.
The former president incites hate. We are working to combat hate. Someone who promotes xenophobia should never again stand behind the seal of the President of the United States of America.
I'm Kamala Harris, and I approve this message.
But what has the Democratic Party done to gain the Filipino American vote within Nevada specifically? According to AP News, during the 2022 midterm elections, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee ran a series of ads in Nevada, many of which they ran in Tagalog, the national language of the Philippines. They ran the ads in community newspapers as well as on the Filipino radio station. It is very likely that they will do, or that they already have done, something similar in the upcoming elections. Harris and Walz themselves visited Nevada at the beginning of August, the final stop in their battleground state tour. The pair held a rally in Las Vegas, where most Filipino Americans reside in the state. While Harris did not specifically address Filipino Americans in her speech, she put a large emphasis on supporting working families, particularly those within the service and hospitality industries, where many Filipino Americans work.
And it is my promise to everyone here, when I am president, we will continue our fight for working families of America. Including to raise the minimum wage and eliminate taxes on tips for service and hospitality workers.
Harris appealed to the notion of the American dream, a concept that often resonates with many Filipino American voters.
And we're not going back because, Nevada, we fight for the future. With affordable health care, affordable child care, and paid leave. We fight for a future where we build a broad-based economy where every American has an opportunity to own a home, to start a business, and to build wealth.
So what about Republican actions to court the Filipino American vote in Nevada? Well, for starters, it's worth reiterating that many of Trump's previous actions may very well have alienated Filipino Americans across the country. Many of Trump's anti-Asian rhetoric surrounding the pandemic frustrated many Asian American voters. His anti-immigration rhetoric was no better.
While campaigning in August of 2016, Trump proclaimed at a Portland rally, quote, "We are letting people come in from terrorist nations that shouldn't be allowed because you can't vet them," unquote. He then went on to name the countries of Afghanistan, Iraq, Morocco, Pakistan, Somalia, and others, including the Philippines.
"We're dealing with animals," he concluded. Those Filipino Americans who were unlucky enough to hear the speech were appalled to have been included in this list and overtly called animals. Beyond Trump's rhetoric, a number of Trump's policies while in office posed a clear disadvantage to many immigrant communities, including Filipino Americans. According to CNN, Trump made it far more challenging for immigrants who rely on food stamps, Medicaid, or subsidized housing to obtain legal status, claiming that they had become a public charge, taking money from U.S. taxpayers. Many Filipino American immigrants rely on such resources when they first arrive in the United States. So what are Republicans doing to gain the Filipino American vote despite all of this? In 2022, and courting the AAPI vote, Republicans placed a large emphasis on public safety in Asian American communities and the proclaimed negative impacts of affirmative action on Asian American students.
The case is over, though, so they can't rely on it this time around. Also in 2022, Republicans, more than ever, published various campaign materials in a number of Asian languages, seeking to expand their audience. However, Republican efforts to court minority voters in Nevada are ultimately uncleared. According to the Nevada Independent, in 2020 and 2022, the Republican National Committee sought to attract BIPOC voters by opening several minority outreach centers in Las Vegas Valley, Nevada. This included an Asian American Pacific Islander Community Center. However, many of these centers, including the Asian American Pacific Islander Community Center, have now closed, replaced by other businesses with no sign of reopening. On August of this year, Trump did visit Las Vegas. While he did not specifically address Filipino Americans or Asian American communities, he, like Harris, did take the time to recognize working-class Nevadans, particularly those in the service and hospitality industries, where, as we know, many Filipino Americans work.
So it seems that there might be a fair amount of Filipino Americans that support Trump. But given all that we've talked about throughout this episode, given their stance on single issues, how do you see Filipino Americans in Nevada voting this upcoming election?
It's always hard to answer these questions, right? Because there's so many various factors that might go into play, and people could change their minds right on the day of the election. But if we take a look at some of the data from AAPI data, there was a survey conducted back in June. This was when Joe Biden was still at the top of the ticket. And even then, there's roughly half of Filipino Americans saying that they would support Joe Biden, that they found him favorable, that they find Kamala Harris favorable as well. It's a fair point that a fair amount also find Trump favorable as well. So about 36% of Filipino Americans said that they found Trump to be either very or somewhat favorable. So you're absolutely right. This is a community that's split, and that really creates an opportunity for these candidates to go out and do outreach to them, not only on the presidential ticket, but further down the ballot. There's a big Senate race going on in Nevada. There's other congressional races as well. Everyone from both parties has that opportunity to go out and earn the votes of these voters. This is a community that is fairly split. The majority, for sure, leans towards Democrats, but there's also plenty of people who say they don't know, that they want to vote for some other party, and that's fair game.
And so, to that point, can Filipino Americans be truly considered a cohesive voting bloc if the vote is split within the community?
If we're looking at some of the generalizations of their socioeconomic status, right, tend to be fairly middle class, working folks with family oriented, as we've talked about with those Catholic backgrounds,
right? Just
as we would assume to find some of those similar pieces in the Latino community or others. There's some of that split that's going on.
Yeah, there's a lot to learn. I mean, every time we dive into a community in these episodes, I learn so much. And it's true, right? Like, the Filipino community is no different than any other community in the U.S.
No community is a monolith.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Nationally Podcast, brought to you by Immigrantly Media. We hope that you like this episode.
Nationally releases weekly on Thursdays on all streaming platforms.
If you have thoughts you'd like to share with us, please email them to info@immigrantlypod.com. or reach out to our socials at Immigrantly Media on Instagram and Immigrantly_pod on X.
You can find me on all of the socials at Sara Sadhwani.
And you can find me on all the socials at JUANDR47.
Nationally is produced by Sadia Khan and Sophia Sanchez. This episode is written by Emmanuel Monahan.
Our sound designer and editor is Juan Velez. The Nationally theme music is by Simon Hutchinson. Additional music is by Epidemic Sound.
Thanks so much for listening, and have a great week.